Off. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julie Heiser. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Director of the National Travel and Tourism Office at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And joining us today, and really the superstar of the show who needs no actual introduction, is Carol Ream, who is the Vice President of Research and Analytics for Brand USA. Everybody knows what Brand USA is, but just in case for expedient purposes, it is basically the nation's destination marketing organization. Research and analytics department that Carol's responsible for, market research, including consumer insights, market sizing, and projections, as well as quantifying their marketing effectiveness. So she has a gigantic job. She is a longstanding member, expert of the industry, and is a sought-after speaker. She's regularly quoted by all kinds of communications organs, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. She has a background in travel distribution and marketing, combined with her research expertise, and has been established as just one of the most trusted authorities on global traveler and commercial trends. If you have questions before I turn this over to Carol, please use the Q&A box. We will either ask those. I'll stop Carol and ask those questions, or I will hold the questions until later. So if you don't hear me, stop her right away and ask her the question that you have asked. Don't fret, because we will have time at the end as well. But Carol said she didn't mind being interrupted. So without any further explanations or going-ons from me, Carol, why don't you take it away, and we will get this party started. Thanks so much for being with us today, everybody.
Thank you, Julie. I wish you could do my intro always and forever. The best. So here we are, and as we think about the past 6 months and kind of what we are in store for, it is hard to not feel a sense of exasperation. Time in some ways just can't go fast enough as we wait for the first signs of recovery. And all of us, I think, are sharing this kind of feeling as we are looking for any indicators, any signs, and slow that they may be, we are starting to see some of those early green shoots, which is exciting in some sense. But also we know that recovery is indeed a long ways away. So patience is going to be something that we're all going to have to get a lot of over the coming months and perhaps even years. But my hope today is to be able to share with you some information so that you understand where things are. It is a very dynamic sort of set of forces that are happening around the world. So give you a sense of what's going on, to help arm you with information to make better plans and just get a better sense of what's ahead. So first, let's take a look at the pace of coronavirus around the world and what's happening. So much of policy, so much of what's happening in our industry is really driven by, first and foremost, what's going on with the contagion. As we look at new confirmed cases, and this is really what helps us understand the spread of the disease around the world, how fast that's happening, over the past few weeks, we've seen things start to begin to slow down a bit, which is a great thing to see. So through much of June and July around the world, we saw a pretty aggressive slope upwards. So it's nice to see that flatten off in the first few weeks of August. And the United States has been a big part of that slope off, at least in North America. So really nice to see the beginnings of stabilization, what is hopefully stabilization and decline in terms of new cases. And when we look at the different regions around the world, it's interesting to note that Asia relatively late in terms of the volume of cases compared to a lot of the other regions of the world. So Europe and North America, you can see those numbers start to balloon in sort of later March, and then South and Central Caribbean and sort of the Americas outside of North America and Asia kind of coming in towards the later months. Looking at kind of the countries that have the largest number of cases, we're looking here at India, US and Brazil compared to Europe, just sort of aggregating Europe is more of a similar scale to these individual companies to help give you a sense of relativity. So the United States, as I mentioned, starting in August, coming back down in terms of new cases. Again, great to see. India is now sort of the #1 country in the world in terms of new cases, but also in India, we started to see a sloping off of that increase, which is, again, great to see. And Brazil is sort of stable, still at an elevated level, of course, across all of these different markets. I think the thing that is quite concerning when we look at this chart is the directionality of what we see in Europe. So they kind of stabilized in late April and flattened out, and in sort of the later part of July and going into August, we see an upward trajectory again, coming back to Europe. So we're going to take a look at some of the individual countries underneath that. The first, this is just the rest of the top 10 in terms of the number of new cases around the world. So Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Mexico, representing Latin America, which is a significant portion of the number of countries on this chart. And Russia, I think overall, it's had a very long but steady decline. So they've looked to have been able to stabilize what's happening in terms of their new cases. And also Mexico has begun to come down and stabilize a little bit as well. So when we look at the other countries, Spain, for example, showing this upward trajectory, that is, of course, quite worrisome when we think about the European market. And a lot of the countries within Europe starting to re-examine some of their reopening and thinking about sort of creating new or bringing back restrictions to help combat that spread that's happening in Europe. Taking a look now at specifically Brand USA's target markets. So I think a lot of you would have the same target markets as you think about your organizations. And overall, we've gone through sort of the largest countries in terms of new cases, so India and Brazil and Mexico. So let's remove them to take a look at what's happening underneath, because the scale is just so difficult to see with those larger case countries. So as I mentioned, Europe is starting to see a bit of a resurgence. So France and Germany, the UK, as well as Spain, as we talked about before, kind of following a similar trajectory upward. France having the most aggressive upward trajectory. Hopefully they'll have sort of smoothed this out. In the past couple of weeks, it's still a little bit too early to tell in terms of what's happening there. Asia had been really quite successful in containing the spread. However, Japan started to see a bit of a surge in late July, early August, and it looks like they've already been able to hopefully tamp that down. Korea is a country that has been grappling with COVID for a really long time, just now starting to see a bit of a resurgence. And so even though these numbers are incredibly low, as a market, Korea is having a very sort of strong reaction to that. And as we go through the consumer trends, it's interesting to see just what the proportions look like. From the perspective of the United States, looking at the Korean numbers at just a few hundred, that seems absolutely minuscule to the scale of what we've been seeing in the United States. But if you look at the consumer reaction, it is outsized in comparison. So one of the super interesting things we've been able to learn is just how different countries around the world view COVID and how it impacts their travel plans. And there are huge variations as we look market to market. So current relative conditions, as we think about what's happening, we can't just think about the number of cases. The directionality is super important to understand, especially when we think about consumer mindset and are people pessimistic or are they optimistic? So often, more than the number itself, it's the directionality. So seeing the accelerated curves in Europe, UK, France, Germany, as well as India. We have them in this accelerating category versus these flattened markets, Brazil, Mexico, Japan, Australia, and Canada, and then the decelerated markets, China and South Korea. However, as I mentioned with South Korea, because we're starting to see a little bit of an upswing in cases in the recent weeks, we might put that in the accelerating category, especially as we look at the consumer reaction to what's happening with that trend line. So wrapping up this look at what's going on with the disease itself, I think the important thing as we think about what does this mean for us and what is the road ahead and what is it going to take for travel to begin to come back. Testing is widely viewed as a critical step in giving people consumer confidence to be able to get on planes and countries to have the confidence to welcome visitors and know that they're not having or potentially inviting issues with more or accelerated spread of the disease itself. So testing, obviously, there's been a ton of work being done in developing new tests and different kinds of tests. This is a snapshot from the US FDA website on just the different types of corona tests that are out there. So the molecular tests being the most accurate, looking for genetic material, specifically RNA. The challenge being that it takes so long still, at this point, up to weeks, sometimes maybe even longer, to get those test results. The antigen test, kind of in the middle, generally a lot faster, typically 1 hour or less in terms of time, not quite as accurate as the molecular test. And so the concern there is that the positive results are usually quite accurate, the negative results aren't as accurate. So certainly a challenge when it comes to widespread adoption and using it as a tool to make sure people are cleared for travel. And then finally, the antibody test, which is really more just to understand if someone has had it at some point previously. It is not good for indicating if you have a current infection. So that's just some of the differences that are out there. I think what's key is that as we think about the application for tests like this for travel, we've seen examples where airlines and countries are trying to implement these tests as part of the pre-boarding process or the arrivals process to help alleviate some of the concerns about the spread of COVID-19 and potentially having to avoid or necessitating the 2-week quarantine that we're seeing in a number of different places. So hopefully with the scaled up production and increased speed of test results, we may see this being incorporated into the travel process, specifically more likely the international travel process, to help alleviate some of those concerns and bring sort of the numbers back to closer to at least where they were before.
Hey, Carol, sorry to interrupt. Is there any possibility that you've got a set of headphones that you could plug in? We're having some real snappy, crackly sounds. I don't know whether that will help at all. If you've got them, that would be great. If you don't, we'll just, we're just having them. People are saying, and I'm hearing it too, that there's a lot of snap, crackle, and pop happening. It may not have anything to do with, where you are in relation to your mic, but I was just thinking that might help.
Let me.
If you don't have them handy, don't worry, but maybe move yourself closer to the screen or jockey your computer just a little bit.
Hey, Carol, this is other Julie. If you could also please turn off your video camera, I think that might help with our bandwidth issues as well, please.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
All right. So hopefully this is better, and if it's not,
actually it is better, Carol. You're now we're gold. Good.
Okay, great. My face was taking up a lot of bandwidth, I guess. Okay, so now let's take a look at economic impact. So we've gotten a sense of where things are with the disease itself. Let's take a look at what impact it's having economically and also, of course, on travel. Now, as we were going into 2020, we already knew 2020 was going to be a rough year. And believe it or not, this is my slide from January from one of my presentations. We knew going into this that it was going to be a rough year. Obviously, we had no idea how rough it was going to be. And my choice of Tom Hanks as the poster child for 2020 was definitely sort of an unintended premonition. But I think what's important is to get a sense of history. And when we talk about growth trajectory, I think it's helpful to also level set to where we were in 2019. So these are the regional arrivals inbound to the United States from these regions around the world. So clearly North America is the largest in terms of arrivals to the United States. And here we have year to date through June. And you can see the clear drop off in the volume. So of course, in any year, it would be a huge drop off as this is volume. But if we look at the growth, you get a sense of how dramatic that drop off has been. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these numbers, but I think it just helps give a bit of context to where the direction was before. So North America, 2019, already a bit tough in terms of growth. And then so when we think about the 2020 numbers, we're building them on top of 2019. That was already a tough year for North America. And Asia was kind of a singular bright spot along with Central America, which is much smaller in terms of volume. But seeing that growth in 2019, that was kind of a positive trajectory, actually being driven, and even in the very early part of this year, by Japan, which is a market that we haven't seen a lot of growth from. So that's just a bit of a snapshot in terms of where we were in terms of growth. And then on a country basis, as we look at the individual countries, obviously a similar trend. And when we look at sort of where the growth was coming from, there were certain markets that were a bit more on the upswing, those that have been kind of, so for example, Argentina. This is a market that's been struggling overall just with its overall domestic economy, and that's really what was driving some of the trends in Argentina. But for the most part, going back to the top 10 in terms of arrivals, 2019 was a relatively soft year. A lot of these markets were showing a relatively flat trend before we got to 2020. So again, just to look at the growth trajectory on a market basis, we are anticipating Canada and Mexico to come back a little bit sooner than the other markets. This is again year to date through June, so this has a first quarter that was relatively normal in terms of volume. So as we get through to the end of the year, this is likely going to come down in terms of the year-over-year growth as we finish out the rest of the year. So when we think about the broader
Carol, sorry, can you go back to the slide that you just did?
Yep.
Question, and this is just a generic question. Somebody came in with a question about whether or not this was geared to specifically to Go West states, or if this is national. I believe the answer is it's national, but
yes, this is national.
Okay.
This is from NTTU.
There we go. Thanks.
So when we think about comparing the contraction and understanding and putting into scale with other sort of big impacts on the US economy, the coronavirus-related recession is estimated to be roughly 2.5 times what we experienced with the global financial crisis of 2008 and the worst that we've seen since World War II. So obviously quite dramatic, but not all experienced in 2020. as we think about tracking recovery and what to expect, all this information is coming from Oxford Economics, and what they're saying is kind of a two-stage recovery, where right after the initial shock in March, going into April, a bit of steeper recovery from that initial shock, and then it's sort of stalling and flattening out as we're struggling through a surge in COVID cases through June and July. So the pace and the kind of trajectory of this recovery curve has two different phases, where it's really slowed down in the more recent months and is expected to kind of continue on that slower trajectory. And what remains to be seen, of course, the big question mark is what's going to happen as we go into what is typically flu season over the winter, and what kind of additional impacts that has. When we think about global markets and what's happening around the rest of the world and thinking about our source markets, the US is expected to perform relatively well in terms of GDP growth compared to a lot of other mature economies around the world. So the forecast is -4.2% for GDP growth compared to Canada and these European markets. It's actually expected to fare relatively well. China is one large economy that is expected to actually grow in 2020 at 2%. But overall, the United States is relatively close to the world average in terms of GDP growth expectations for 2020. When we think about recovery and the pace of recovery going into 2021 and 22, so on and so forth, it's certainly not expected to pop right back immediately. And what is really difficult to project is the relationship between GDP growth and travel. Historically, travel has outpaced GDP growth, but because of the nature of COVID-19 and how it so directly impacts international travel specifically, we may see travel actually lag behind some of these global GDP trends, which would be a reversal from years before. In terms of international visits and spending, these projections show that we're not expected to reach 2019 levels for about 4 years. So 2024 is kind of neck and neck with where we were in 2019 in terms of these projections. So as I mentioned, it's going to take quite a bit of time to rebuild. And so we're likely to see travel not come back quite as quickly as we'd like, but certainly a pretty healthy recovery going into 2021 compared to where we are in 2020. So, Julie, unless there are any questions about the economic stuff, we can dig into consumer sentiment.
Keep rolling, Carol. We're good.
All right. So when we think about the impact of something as monumental as a global pandemic, I think it's helpful to use some frameworks to think about how people react to such shocks to the system. And the Kübler-Ross emotional response framework, I think, is really helpful to just kind of plot it out and think about where we are with things. So, you know, in spring, we were kind of in that shock mode. Perhaps there was a bit of denial. And we kind of go through, I think we can relate to this on a personal level, the feelings of frustration, dealing with the immediate impact. We've lost so many colleagues as positions have been cut in our industry. It's been a very, very difficult time. But I do believe we are now in the experimentation phase, and consumers are in the experimentation phase. And that's not going to jump immediately into international travel. It starts with doing things locally, starting to incorporate recreational activities, understanding and always being mindful of safety first and foremost. But we're starting to see that experimentation. So domestic travel starting to come back. certain types of trips starting to come back. And this experimentation phase is likely to go on for quite some time until there is definitive direction on treatment and prevention like vaccines, until that timeline is clear, until things are, that murkiness, that uncertainty kind of goes away. We're likely to remain in this experimentation phase. And as we have setbacks, as there is another wave, as restrictions come back, it's likely to again go through a cycle where we may regress to frustration, having to deal with that again, and kind of being stuck in the circle until there is definitive resolution for the disease itself. So in the meantime, as we think about international travel, anxiety around the world remains elevated, because even for countries, as Europe is an example of, even if countries get past their first wave, there is always concern about a secondary one. The vigilance has to remain elevated, and that creates a bit of anxiety that remains elevated. So what we're looking at here is likelihood to travel internationally in the next 12 months. So a pretty long window to think about just where people are in terms of how they feel towards international travel. So we have a nice long window there, and it also allows us to compare to some historical information. So this is a comparison of likelihood to travel in the sort of displayed months compared to their 2019 average. So we have some baseline that we're working with. And across the board, we can see there's been a significant drop. Most specifically in Japan and Korea, they've had the strongest reaction to it. In other markets, in particular the emerging markets, India and Mexico, for example, tend to be a bit more optimistic than some of the mature markets. I'd say the global average, if you kind of let your eye go across, is roughly about 30%. Some are less, some are more. That seems to be the general benchmark and where people have settled into. Again, certain markets certainly higher than that. Canada, for example, obviously hugely important to the United States, has continued to actually become a little bit more pessimistic over the past few months. And only really China is looking, China and India, perhaps a bit the UK, is starting to see a little bit of optimism start to come back, but overall pretty significant sort of drops in intent to travel across the board. Of course, there are some key demographic differences, and one thing that we've discovered is women generally tend to be a little bit more pessimistic than men when it comes to their intent to travel across these different countries. This past month, the UK was actually an exception where the women were more optimistic. So if we compare this to prior months, the men have remained relatively consistent. It was the women that became more optimistic in the past month. Now, time will tell if that stays that way. I would say this is most likely a bit of an anomaly, a little bit of a blip in the data more than a definitive trend, but that kind of remains to be seen. But overall, in most markets, again, China is also an exception where the women are a bit more optimistic than men. It's usually the other way around. Age factors. So when we think about who gets the most impacted by COVID-19, especially in the beginning, we were reading that this was really most concerning for older people, and that younger people didn't seem to be as susceptible to the symptoms, and it wasn't quite as dangerous for them. So just off the bat, because of the disease itself, you'd expect to see some differences in age. But one of the things that's interesting is over time, we're starting to see the differentials between the different age groups start to close. So this is a look at the data from June. So this is the same metric we're looking at, likelihood to travel internationally in the next 12 months. This time it's broken out by age, and the older people are, generally speaking, the more likely they are to say that they are not going to take a trip. So this drop off, you can see, has a very clear relationship with age. As we look at July and then into August, you see that differential start to shrink a bit. So the trend is still definitely there, and in certain markets, it's still quite strong. But in other markets, if we look at Brazil, for example, it's really evened out. And so that's interesting to see that it's sort of becoming less of an age specific issue and just more pervasive. And I think it's probably a good thing that young people are just as concerned or being just as responsible as older travelers would be in thinking about the impact of this disease. Families. So you might wonder, if parents might be more concerned about travel, given that might be concerned about their kids. They want to make sure they're safe. And even though this is not typically a life-threatening virus for children, obviously good parents want to take care of their kids. On the other hand, it has been so trying for people, especially with small children in the household, to manage working from home and being primary caretakers, and then also potentially homeschooling on top of that. So it's been a very trying time. So you might wonder which one would win out. The person sort of that is concerned about their kids and wants to protect them, versus the one who's desperate to have a break. And it's clear that it's mostly the desperation. So people who have children in the household in many markets are substantially more likely to say that they're going to take a trip. Now, it is down from where they were last year. But it's interesting to see just how clear that differential is in most markets. In Canada and South Korea, it's relatively close, so you don't see quite the same differential that we see in some of these other markets. It's interesting to see how consistent it often is around the world. And these are the results from June. And I'm going to flip through to July and then to August, but specifically I'd like you to pay attention to China, because this is the one market where we've seen a very substantial change in the past few months. So specifically the families that don't have children in the household, they were down 46% in June, down 43% in July, and then coming to August, it's now minus 28%. So there's been a huge change in that particular group in China. And we're still sort of digging into what potentially could be driving that. I think that's a very interesting trend, and one that really is unique as we look across the world. So that's something TBD that we're trying to understand a bit and get more insight into what's actually driving that. But it is just a notable thing that we found as we've looked at these trends over time. Now let's think about not traveling. So the very substantial portion of people are saying you're not going to be traveling in the next 12 months. And here are all the reasons why they're not taking a trip. And so we're specifically looking for obviously COVID-related things, but also understanding some basics. The economy is a big concern as well. So what does this look like relative to, the basics of not having time, not having a desire, or some requirements to stay close to home? So overall, not surprisingly, these days, it's really about COVID-19. And so there is the concern about contracting and spreading the disease itself, but there's also concerns about restrictions related to travel. So people don't have the time to spend 2 weeks in quarantine on the front end or the back end. And there's also a concern about the experiences not being available due to those restrictions. So if you can't go to a show, or you can't go to a sporting event, you can't do the activities that you really love about a particular place, then it kind of defeats the purpose of taking that trip. So different markets, again, of course, have different reactions to these things. One of the things that we found that was pretty interesting is if we look at the Asian markets, so China, Japan, and South Korea, we can see that the COVID-related restrictions on traveling and the concern about the activities and experiences are neck and neck. And in other markets, there's a huge variance. So that's one thing we found that is kind of connecting the Asian markets together and just their view of how important those local activities are to their vacation experience. This is a look at now over time, looking at the trend line for the concern about spreading or contracting COVID-19. And just to give you a sense of, has that abated? Has that gotten worse? Has it remained the same? One caveat as we look at this data is that when we first started asking the question, we had a bit more of a catch-all regarding COVID-19. So it wasn't specific to actually personally contracting or spreading the disease. It was more just generically concerned about the spread of COVID-19. And so we reworded that question because we wanted to get more specific, and we did that in May. So the first two bars are not exactly apples to apples. But it is interesting to see that in early March, it wasn't quite at the level that it became sort of later elevated to where it is today. But the April numbers, why they come down soon after is because we split into the various options. So just keep that in mind. The last four bars are the same question and are kind of apples to apples. So overall, we're seeing that there isn't really much improvement. And in fact, in many markets, the concern about contracting the disease has actually gone up. So we have not started to see any sort of improvement there. And it may be the case that until there is systematic testing and or widespread vaccinations available, that we may not see much movement in this. This is a view regarding specifically experiences and activities not being available. And again, this is relatively consistent. And in certain markets, it's much more of a concern. As I mentioned, in the Asian markets, it seems to be a heightened concern around this element. And other markets, it's not as much of a concern. So in France, for example, not nearly as much of a concern as it would be for China. Now let's take a look at finances. Obviously, we talked about the massive economic impact COVID is going to have on markets around the world. This is a look at people saying that they're not going to travel in the next 12 months because they're uncertain about their financial future. And this is overall a pretty positive story because as you can see in a number of markets, this concern is actually abating a little bit. If we look at Australia, there's a clear trend downwards, as well as South Korea. But even as you look at across these different markets, this is a general trend that we see this actually coming down a bit as a primary concern about why not to travel. So for those, going back to those who are planning to travel and take a trip in the next 12 months, let's take a look at how COVID-19 has impacted their travel plans. So this is a range of options for the ways that people might change their travel plans or not. So one example, the first option, no impact on my travel plans. And you can see that there's a very little response to that option because it's kind of difficult to imagine that you could travel internationally and not have COVID in mind and that it wouldn't change any of your plans. But for the most part, the most common response around the world is that people are trying to travel as planned, but just taking their basic cautions to do so. And these numbers that you see are representative of a difference in August compared to July. So this is a month-over-month differential. And for the most part, these options have kind of stabilized as we've been doing this for a number of months now. But there are certain areas where we're seeing a bit of movement that is a bit related to seasonality. So Japan, for example, saw some pretty large shifts month over month where the response, no changes yet, but I may adjust in the future, came way down, and the percentage of people saying that they were postponing their trips has gone way up. And one of the reasons was just seasonality, and we were going into the months of July and August where they just had to decide, am I going to take this trip or am I not going to take this trip? So they couldn't really stay on the fence anymore. So seasonality drives some of this shift as we look at these trends month over month. I think the good thing is that not a lot of people are saying that they're canceling their trip, period. So South Korea is the highest at about 10%. Most other options are more popular. So they're saying, you know, I'm just going to postpone it. I'm not going to cancel it yet. I still want to take this trip. But more often than not, that they're going to continue as planned, but with some precautions. Now, this is a look at specifically the option of not changing travel plans over time. Again, to give you a sense of shift and what happened since March as the disease became more widespread and a bigger concern. So you can see, again, in the beginning of March, not nearly as much of a concern as we come down into the summer months and where we are today. Germany remains probably the most optimistic about their travel plans as we look across these different markets. And part of the reason for that is just much of this travel is intra-regional, so within Europe and within kind of certain corridors of travel. So that kind of remains a bit more optimistic than a lot of different other kinds of international travel, certainly long haul overseas travel. It's a very different picture. So there's a bit of a regional lens through which we have to think about some of these trends. And this is referring to all international travel, not specifically to the United States. This is just any cross-border travel. Traveling is planned with precaution. So we can see the opposite here where there's an upward trajectory as we look across these months. So people are getting more confident about traveling with their precautions and the effectiveness of those precautions. They know how to avoid risk. They know what kinds of activities are safe and what kind they should avoid. And so they're getting a bit more confident over time to move ahead with those travel plans. Again, it's a good thing to see. The flip for no changes yet and may adjust in the future. And so these are people just getting off the fence and making their decisions. So I view this option as being indicative of people saying they have enough information to make their plans. They know what they want to do, they know how to move forward, and they're not waiting. So I do think it's a good thing that we're seeing this come down. As we start to see secondary waves and as we move into another set of seasonality, we might start to see this come back up as people are wondering about what's going to happen in the winter and as they start thinking about their winter trips. So this is likely to see a bit of cyclicality again as we move through those seasons and postponing the trip. So again, we're starting to see this come down in certain markets, which is good to see. Certainly we see that very clear drop in this response in China, for example. But overall, it's a pretty uncommon response, especially as we think about the comparison to people who are taking their trips as planned with precautions. Here's a look at the budgets. So this is for people who are planning to take a trip in the next 12 months. Will they spend less? Will they spend the same? Or will they spend more? And in most markets, people are planning to spend the same or spend a little bit less with a couple of exceptions. So China is a clear exception to this, Brazil as well. And this, we often see this in kind of the emerging markets. There's a lot of optimism in general compared to the more mature markets. So it's not too surprising to see, but overall the responses are pretty small, and for the most part, people are tending to stick to their original plans. When it comes to activities and what sorts of things people will do on their vacation, typically
Something terrible's happening, Carol. You want to try to unmute and see if that fixes it?
Are there sound issues?
Something terribly wrong. Julie, any suggestions for Carol?
Hi, I don't have any suggestions. Carol, can you give it one more time to try speaking?
Is it?
That's better. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
It's okay. It suddenly started storming in Washington, D.C. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I just hear the rain pouring down.
You sound crystal clear now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so travel preferences. So obviously we talked about the changes that people are making to their plans. Their motivations and their priorities are also shifting in light of COVID-19. And this is a range of personal considerations when people are trying to make their destination decisions. So the most common response around the world is rest and relaxation. I don't think that's a surprise for anyone. So I think what's helpful to put this in context is not just look at the responses to just how important these things are, but again, the differentials. What has changed in light of COVID-19? How are people adjusting their priorities? What are they looking for now versus back then? So I think what's most striking is you look at this and going back to children and parents, the response for engaging my children in activities that are specialized from them is much higher. And we only are focused on the people who have children in the household for this question. So you can see how much stronger of a priority that is in this environment today than it was last year. So, and I think anyone who has kids in the household understands and can sympathize with this sentiment. They're not able to go to school, they're not able to hang out with their friends and do the things that are fun for them. So parents are really prioritizing trying to take vacations and take trips that are engaging them and getting them out there. And they're super mindful of trying to benefit our kids in this environment. Other than that, there isn't a ton of difference overall, but one thing that we're typically seeing across these different markets is people are a bit more into the idea of staying within their comfort zone, and they're a little bit less adventurous. They're a little bit less concerned with wanting to see unique attractions and being really indulgent and kind of trying to keep it simple. So in certain markets, we're starting to see people over-index on wanting to keep fit and engage in physically active recreation. But in many markets, we're seeing the priority of wanting to connect with nature and getting outside because we've been stuck inside for so long. And it also happens to be the type of activity where you don't have to be in close quarters with strangers. So overall, I think we're starting to see some of those trends be consistent around the world. But it is interesting to see that really strong priority of family and engaging children in specialized activities. So now let's take a look at the U.S. more specifically and understanding plans for traveling to the United States. But before we do, this is a look at the origin market. So the countries on the bottom going across, these are the origin markets, and the destination they're planning to visit. And we're comparing this, the 2019 average against this last month in August. So overall, starting with the Asia Pacific markets, you can see in certain markets like China, there's a strong tendency or movement to travel within Asia. So you can see the August 6th comparison to the 2019 average, that differential is really quite strong. But in the other Asian markets, it's not quite as strong. So as we think about the implications of that, there is some nuance to it, specifically for Japan and South Korea. When you think about the logistics, when you think about location and geography, the trips, the flight lengths and things like that, sometimes the Pacific Islands of the US kind of fall into what's feasible for them as they think about a certain length of flight and kind of drawing the circumference around their location. So I'll get to that a little bit when we talk more about the US in particular. But if we look at Europe, we start to see a much more consistent kind of upswing in staying within Europe. So their next travel destination being within Europe. And you can see that pretty consistently across the European markets, France, Germany, and the UK. And then the Americas, so Brazil, Canada, and Mexico, you can see a strong sort of preference in particular in Mexico for North America. So people staying closer to home. In Canada, you don't see quite as strong of a shift. It's much sort of more spread out. And Brazil, you see both an uptick in Europe and North America. So it's kind of split between those two regions. If we look specifically at the United States and compare again 2019 to August, we can see that differential for the most part being positive. So people are more likely to say that their next trip is going to be to the United States compared to the 2019 average of everywhere they went. So it's not exactly apples to apples. So the 2019 figures are reflective of all the trips they plan to take in the next 12 months, whereas the August 6th number is just their next trip. But I think overall, what to walk away from, or what we should walk away with, is that our market share is likely to remain relatively strong as we come out of this. Intent to visit the United States will remain really quite strong. And the only market where we see sort of a significant negative trend is China. And that is much beyond the issue of COVID-19. That, that's really the only market where we see kind of a shift potentially in losing market share. And the other markets, the story is actually quite positive, which is great to see. So when are people going to be taking these trips? So again, this is now all international trips, not specifically to the United States, but what month are they looking to travel, or what month do they think they're going to travel? And overall, this is starting to push out pretty far, all the way to next July and next summer with few exceptions. So we're thinking as we look at December, for example, we can see some peaks in Brazil, Japan, Mexico. So we see kind of those peaks for the winter travel months, but for the most part, we're looking at almost a full year out where people are starting to push their trips back. So ultimately, what does this mean? As we wrap up all of these different trends and think about what they mean and what we're looking for as we think about how to plan. So what are the indicators that tell us, what are the indicators that we're looking for to tell us when is the market ready to come back? When should we be thinking about going back to market? And so we bucket things in three different areas. So first, policy, the importance, obviously, freedom of movement is critical. The next, product. So we're starting to see already some significant reopenings in terms of product. And the air product, of course, is the area that is of primary concern, and that's the first thing that we're looking for, is that return of flight capacity. But also, just as important are the reopenings and the capacity levels of key attractions in market. And that's the part that's likely to come back first. And we're already starting to see that. And the last piece, of course, that's super important for us is the indication of positivity. So we're watching consumer confidence really closely, and we're looking for a place where people are starting to get more comfortable, that they understand what to expect and are ready to make those decisions. So even if they're not quite ready to travel yet, we're looking for that confidence that they're ready to book, that they have a sense of they understand and are ready to and willing to accept the risks and ready to make that booking. So with that, I don't think I left too much time for questions, but I think we have time for a few, perhaps. Julie?
We do just have a couple minutes for questions if anybody would like to put a question on the Q&A board or on the chat line. I think I have answered Carol a couple of questions along the way. One of the questions that I do want to clarify, though, is someone asked if you guys had done any polling of domestic travelers for outbound. And I said that I didn't think that that was probably the case since you don't have a domestic or outbound remit, but just to clarify.
That is correct. We do not cover the U.S. domestic market because our purview is solely international inbound.
Okay. All right. I still don't see any questions, so let me leave you guys with this. If you decide that you have some, oh, wait, questions are pouring now in when I said no. Here's one from James Allen. Carol, it says, in terms of commercial aviation lift, what data is available in terms of projected recovery?
That is one of the areas that is a true challenge because airlines typically don't adjust their scheduled fares and scheduled seats till about a month out. If you look at those schedules that are typically done first a year out, they're really quite not accurate beyond a month. So in our monthly webinars, we've been publishing SABRE data for scheduled flights, but it's not quite a complete picture, as I mentioned, anything beyond a month. So it is a challenge, and I think one of the things that we're doing is trying to have more direct conversations because airlines typically keep that pretty close to the vest. So I wish there was a definitive data source I could point you to that would give you good direction longer term, but unfortunately it just doesn't exist.
Okay. David Kasser has said in answer to the previous question that traveler sentiment is similar in domestic markets. So for Graham Bendelow, there you go. If you guys have questions, future questions, you can send those this week to info@gowestsummit.com. And the folks at Go West will try to get the questions to Carol, and Carol can answer them, and they'll put them put the answers into the website for you. We hope you've enjoyed this first opening session. I think it's a great way to kick off this very intriguing and creative way to approach Go West Summit. I wish all of you really good appointments. And with that, if there are no other, oh, wait, I see, wait, hang on. Maybe one more question here. You know, technology is a crazy thing. This says, Go West Tuesday morning session by Insights Collective will address domestic travel, attempting to carry on from Carol's international focus as one of two related parts. So that is great. So you guys have got an even better opportunity to hear what else is happening out there. And again, like I said, if you want to ask Carol a question, it's info@gowestsummit.com. Thanks to each and every one of you for sitting in. We apologize for the audio challenges. Hopefully you guys will not experience that in your future education sessions. But thank you, Carol, so much for being our expert and for leading us through such a great list of stuff. As we said, this is, as you said, I should say, we're in for, I think, unfortunately, a fairly long road ahead, but I'm very excited to think that maybe 21 will be better than 20 and 22 will be better than 21, et cetera. So good luck, everybody, with what you're doing out there. Keep doing it. Stay safe, stay healthy, and wear those masks. Thanks very much.